The day we lowered my grandmother's coffin, I thought we buried all her secrets. But a week later, a box of journals appeared on my porch, and the last page screamed my name. The church bells tolled in that slow, mournful rhythm that carries across an entire town, as if even the air wanted to bow its head. I remember gripping the edge of the wooden pew so tightly that my knuckles ached, my eyes locked on the mahogany coffin that held the body of the woman who had been my compass. My grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, had lived 84 years in our small American town, and every single one of those years seemed to echo inside the church walls that morning. She was the matriarch of our family, the keeper of traditions, the one whose hands had braided my hair when I was little, and whose voice had soothed me through the storms of adolescence. Yet as the choir's voices swelled, my gaze shifted to the people sitting around me. My uncles fidgeting, my cousins whispering, my mother staring stiffly ahead with lips pressed together. There was no warmth in their expressions, no softness in their grief. The funeral felt less like a farewell and more like a business transaction they wanted to conclude quickly. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief was making me paranoid, but the cracks were there. My Uncle Robert checked his watch 3 times during the eulogy, his impatience so naked it made my stomach twist. My cousin Lisa kept scrolling through her phone under the pew, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen, as though saying goodbye to the woman who raised us was nothing more than an inconvenience. And then there was the silence. That strange, suffocating silence when certain stories should have been told, certain memories shared. No one mentioned Grandma's teaching days, the way she had fought for women's education in a time when our county barely cared about it. No one brought up her garden, the one that had fed half the neighborhood during hard years. It was as if pieces of her life had been deliberately erased, like chalk rubbed off a board before class ended. When the coffin was lowered into the earth, I pressed my hand against the cold wood one last time. Beneath my palm, I whispered a promise. I'll remember everything. The dirt thudded against the lid, and the sound struck me as final. But even then, something in my bones told me the story wasn't finished. Though someone had scrubbed away her existence, leaving nothing but the shell of a house. I asked my mother where all of Grandma's belongings had gone. Her answer was too quick. She wanted things tidy. She gave most of it away before she passed. I didn't believe her. My grandmother was sentimental to her core. She kept every birthday card I'd ever made her, every photograph, no matter how blurred. She would never have erased herself like this. That night, I went to bed restless, replaying the stiffness of the funeral, the emptiness of the house, the way my relatives seemed relieved rather than grief-stricken. Something was wrong, though I couldn't name it yet. A week later, I heard the knock. It was just past dusk, the kind of twilight when shadows lengthen across the porch and the air turns cool with the promise of night. I opened the door, expecting a neighbor. Instead, I found a box. It was old, weathered, its corners frayed, the cardboard stained by years of storage. No note, no signature, no delivery slip, just a box, sitting like a silent accusation on my doorstep. My heart thudded as I pulled it inside. When I pried it open, the smell of aged paper and dust filled my living room, familiar yet oddly intimate. Inside were journals, dozens of them, some bound in cracked leather, others in simple spiral notebooks with faded covers. My breath caught. The handwriting was hers, slanted cursive, neat but firm, the way she always wrote her grocery lists, her recipes, her Christmas card. I picked one up and traced the ink with trembling fingers. These were her thoughts, her stories, her secrets. Hours passed as I flipped through pages filled with her voice. She wrote about childhood summers on her parents' farm, about falling in love with my grandfather, about the births of her children. But then the tone shifted. In later years, her entries grew sharper, more guarded, as though she knew someone might one day read them and she wanted the truth preserved no matter the cost. She mentioned betrayals, hinted at conflicts, described nights she couldn't sleep because the weight of silence pressed too heavy. Then I opened the last journal. Its cover was darker, newer than on. The missing stories, the silences. It all began to stitch together into something dark and undeniable. These journals weren't meant to come to me. Someone had hidden them, tried to bury them just like we buried her body. And whoever had tried to silence her voice had failed, because now I held the proof in my hands. And as I stared at that last page with my name written in her unsteady hand, I knew this wasn't just about family secrets. This was a warning, a message from the grave that I was never supposed to see. The first page wasn't about me. It was about a murder that no one in my family ever spoke of. I sat at my dining table long after midnight, the journals spread out before me like sacred relics. The house was quiet, except for the steady hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of wood as it settled in the cool night air. The weight of them was almost unbearable. Each one was heavy, not just with paper, but with decades of memory. Pieces of my grandmother's soul pressed between covers that had survived fire, flood, or worse. I felt like I was trespassing into a world I was never meant to enter, a place where her private thoughts and forbidden truths lay waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to read them. I opened one of the older journals, the leather cracked, its edges curling like brittle leaves. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers. Elegant cursive, looping with confidence in her younger years. She wrote about her girlhood in the 1940s, about carrying water from the well, about the taste of cornbread baked in her mother's iron skillet, about the first time she saw the county fair lights. There was tenderness in her words, a sweetness that made me ache, because I realized how little I had asked her about her own youth while she was alive. To me, she had always been a grandmother, wise, gentle, steady, but here she was a girl again, unsure and hopeful, just like I had once been. But as the pages turned, her voice changed. I saw entries about her courtship with my grandfather, about the thrill of his smile and the way he danced her around the town square. And yet, even here, shadows crept in. She mentioned the things I cannot write. No grass. The entry continued. They told me it was an accident, that he had fallen by the tracks after too much drink, but I saw the bruises around his neck. I saw the way they carried him into the barn before night fell. God forgive me, I didn't speak. I didn't dare. I pressed a hand against my mouth to stifle the cry that threatened to escape. My grandmother was writing about a death, a violent death, that had never been spoken of in our family. I had grown up on stories of Sunday picnics, of quilting bees, of cousins playing tag in the fields. No one had ever told me about a murder. As I turned the pages, the details thickened like fog. She described the victim only as Thomas, but the way she wrote his name, with a kind of reverence, told me he was more than a passing acquaintance. She wrote that Thomas deserved better, that they made sure his story was erased. My mind spun through possibilities. Who was Thomas? Why had he been silenced? And why had my grandmother felt compelled to record it when silence seemed to be the family's law? I thought back to childhood moments I had long forgotten. Nights when I woke to the sound of muffled arguments downstairs. Times when my mother hushed me if I asked why Uncle Robert never liked to walk near the old rail yard. Even a memory of my grandmother herself, pulling me away from a local parade when the town sheriff walked by, whispering, "We don't talk about him." At the time, I had assumed she simply disliked politics. Now I wondered if she had been shielding me from truths too dangerous to carry as a child. The unease grew sharper with every page. It was as if I had slipped into a parallel world where my family's cheerful history was nothing but a carefully painted mask. And then I noticed something else. The journals weren't intact. Several pages were missing, cleanly torn out, leaving only ragged edges clinging to the spine. Some covers were scratched, as if someone had tried to obliterate what was written. In one notebook, entire weeks were missing, the dates skipping forward unnaturally, as if someone had carefully censored her words. It wasn't just age. This was deliberate. Someone had tampered with them. That realization made me shiver. My grandmother's house had been stripped bare, her belongings erased, her story silenced, and yet these journals had survived. Had she hidden them? Or had someone else tried to destroy them and failed? Chair, exhausted but unable to stop reading. The journals were no longer simply diaries. They were testimony, they were evidence, and they were dangerous. I gathered them back into the box, my hands brushing against the cardboard walls as if searching for reassurance. That was when I felt it. A faint ridge at the bottom of the box, as if the cardboard was thicker in one spot. I tapped it and heard a hollow sound. My pulse quickened. I turned the box over and found a small compartment built into the base, a hidden panel that didn't belong in an ordinary box. My fingers pried it open, and there, tucked away like contraband, was a journal unlike the others. Its cover was darker, bound in leather that had not cracked with age, but gleamed as though it had been handled recently. Around it was tied a ribbon, deep red, knotted tightly, sealing it shut as though to forbid entry. I lifted it out, my hands trembling. This was no ordinary record. This one had been hidden deliberately, concealed even from the collection that was already secret. Whoever tied that ribbon had meant to keep its contents from ever being read. And yet here it was, in my hands. And in that moment, staring at the sealed journal with its blood-red ribbon, I realized that whatever secrets my grandmother had carried, this was the one the family would have killed to protect. The sealed journal wasn't meant to be opened, but I had to know why my uncle tried to take it from me. For hours I sat with that journal on my lap, the ribbon digging into my fingers as I turned it over and over, unable to decide whether to cut it open or leave it untouched. My grandmother's words still echoed in my head from the other entries, the trembling ink, the mention of bruises, the shadows of silenced stories. This one was different. It didn't just contain her voice. It contained something she, or someone else, had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep hidden. I felt like I was betraying her by even thinking of breaking that ribbon. All my life, I had seen her journals stacked neatly on her nightstand, always closed when company came. They had been hers, private as prayers, and I had respected that boundary. But now, with her gone, and her name scrawled desperately across those last pages, I couldn't shake the answer. Standing on my porch was my Uncle Robert. His sudden presence made me freeze. He had barely spoken to me at the funeral beyond a quick handshake, yet here he was, shifting from foot to foot like a man on urgent business. His smile was strained, his eyes restless. "Thought I'd check on you," he said, brushing past me before I even invited him in. His suit jacket smelled faintly of cologne and cigarette smoke, the combination oddly sour in my nostrils. Inside, he walked straight to the living room, his gaze sweeping the space in a way that felt less like concern and more like search. My stomach tightened. "I know losing your grandma was hard," he said too quickly, settling into the armchair as though he owned it. "Sometimes the best way to move on is not to dwell. You don't want to get stuck in the past." There was something rehearsed in his tone, something brittle, and as he spoke, his eyes kept darting, not to me, not to the photographs on the wall, but to the box of journals sitting half-hidden under the coffee table. My pulse quickened. I followed his gaze and saw a bead of sweat glistening on his temple. "What's in the box?" he asked, casual in words but sharp in tone. "Her things," I said, careful, watching his reaction. His jaw tightened. "She didn't leave you much, did she? Probably best to just let the past go. Start fresh." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the box now. His hands twitched slightly, as though he wanted to reach for it but restrained himself. That was when the words slipped out of his mouth, too fast, too raw. "I thought those journals were destroyed." The air between us froze. My breath caught in my throat. His eyes widened slightly, as though realizing too late what he had just revealed. He leaned back quickly, covering it with a chuckle. "I mean, I didn't think she'd still kept any of those old things. They're worthless, really." But the damage was done. The truth was out. My grandmother's house had been stripped bare because someone had deliberately tried to erase her records, and my uncle had expected those journals never to resurface. I felt a wave of anger rise in me, hot and bitter. "Why would you think they were destroyed?" I asked, my voice steady, though my hands shook. "Did you have something to do with that?" His face hardened, all pretense of casual care slipping away. "Be careful what you're accusing. Leave it alone, or you'll regret it." The slam of the door shook the house. I stood in the silence that followed, heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. His words weren't just a warning. They were a threat. The ribbon-bound journal sat on the table, its presence heavier now than ever. I stared at it, my grandmother's voice whispering through memory. Don't trust everyone. That night I couldn't sleep. I locked the front door, double-checked the windows, then carried the sealed journal upstairs with me like it was a treasure and a curse. I placed it in the top drawer of my nightstand, turned the key, and tucked the key under my pillow. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, every creak of the house making me flinch. Images flashed in my mind. Robert's sweating forehead, his eyes fixed on the box, his slip of the tongue. He had known about the journals. He had expected them to be gone, and the fact that they weren't clearly unsettled him. I drifted into a restless sleep, clinging to the thought that the journal was safe, that in the morning I would finally cut the ribbon and uncover whatever truth it held. But when dawn came, my world shifted again. I opened the drawer, expecting to see the dark leather cover waiting for me. It was empty. The journal was gone. And as I gripped the cold metal of the drawer handle, a sick realization sank in. Someone had been inside my locked bedroom while I slept. Whoever stole the sealed journal left something else in its place, a warning note. The moment I saw the empty drawer, my body went cold. The ribboned journal, the one thing I had guarded like a secret heartbeat, was gone. My first thought was that I had misplaced it, that somehow in my haze of fear last night I had set it down elsewhere. I tore through the bedroom, ripping open the closet, checking under the bed, overturning pillows. My hands shook so badly that I nearly dropped the lamp as I pulled it aside to check behind the nightstand. It wasn't there. Instead, lying where the journal should have been, was a folded piece of paper. My pulse hammered as I reached for it. The paper was thick, torn from a legal pad, but the handwriting scrawled across it in black ink made my breath catch. It was jagged, rushed, almost carved into the page as
standing up. How had they gotten in? The door had been locked, the windows latched. My uncle's face flashed in my mind. His two smooth words, the sweat glistening on his brow, his slip about the journals. Had he come back? Or was someone else involved? Someone who had been circling this secret long before I even knew it existed. Fear clawed at my stomach, but underneath it, stronger than the trembling in my hands, was determination. If they wanted me to stop, it meant I was close to something, close to the truth my grandmother had buried in these pages. And then, like a whisper carried through time, her voice returned to me. The last weeks of her life, when I sat by her bedside, holding her fragile hand as she drifted between lucidity and silence. More than once she had pulled me close, her breath thin and raspy, her eyes darting toward the door as if afraid of being overheard. "Don't trust everyone," she had murmured. "Not all family is family. Promise me you'll follow them." At the time, I had thought it was just the confusion of age, the wandering thoughts of a woman in decline. But now, with the warning note in my hand, I realized she had been preparing me. She had known. She had seen this coming. I gathered the rest of the journals onto the bed, flipping through them desperately. My fingers caught on torn pages, places where whole entries had been ripped away, leaving only frayed stubs of paper. In the margins of others, I noticed faint marks I hadn't paid attention to before, tiny crosses, loops, and symbols that didn't fit her usual style of writing. One entry from the mid-1970s caught my eye. The writing was faint, almost faded to dust, but in the corner she had drawn what looked like a key. Beneath it, barely visible, she had underlined a phrase 3 times: "The old orchard." Another journal from the 1980s contained a single star scratched in ink along the side of an otherwise ordinary passage about preserving peaches. I ran my finger over it, heart thudding. The markings weren't random. They were breadcrumbs, hidden in plain sight. Piece by piece, and found another clue. A faint set of initials scrawled in the bottom corner. R.H. My stomach clenched. Robert. My uncle's initials. The one who had just told me to leave the past buried. A chill ran through me. My grandmother hadn't only written about the orchard, she had tied it to him. I sat back, breathing hard. The orchard wasn't just a forgotten piece of family land. It was connected to the secrets she had been trying to record. It was connected to whatever my uncle didn't want me to find. The warning note still lay on the floor, its words dark against the paper. Stop digging. Let the past rest. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I picked it up, folded it carefully, and slid it between the pages of the journal where the orchard had been underlined. It felt fitting, like locking their threat inside the very story they wanted to silence. As the afternoon sun slid behind the trees outside my window, the decision crystallized inside me. I was going to the orchard, alone, because if my grandmother had left breadcrumbs leading there, then that was where the truth still lived, and no warning note in the world was going to stop me from finding it. Grandma's abandoned farmhouse smelled of dust, but in the attic I found a trunk full of names. The road out to the old family property was narrower than I remembered, a winding stretch of cracked asphalt that seemed to disappear into itself the farther I drove. The summer sun was sinking low, but the trees pressed in so close it already felt like twilight. Each bend brought a new shiver of unease, a fresh reminder that I was heading somewhere my family had always avoided, somewhere spoken of only in passing. The orchard came into view first, rows of gnarled trees long since surrendered to weeds and wild growth, their branches tangled together like skeletal fingers clutching at the evening sky. When I was small, I used to imagine fairies living here, darting through the blossoms. Now it looked like something from a nightmare, a place that had outlived its beauty and grown mean with neglect. Beyond the orchard, half hidden by the slope of the hill, the farmhouse crouched like a forgotten sentinel. Its paint had peeled away in strips, leaving gray wood exposed to years of weather. One shutter dangled by a single hinge, though the house itself had been waiting for me. Faded wallpaper curled away from the walls. A moth darted across the hallway, startled by my intrusion. The silence was heavy, pressing in from every corner, disturbed only by the creak of old floorboards under my... I moved slowly, room by room, forcing myself to look where I had once been forbidden. The kitchen still smelled faintly of rust and old wood smoke. The living room, stripped bare, offered no comfort, only the remnants of curtains eaten away by moths. I kept glancing toward the ceiling, my eyes tracing the faint square of the attic door. The ladder groaned as I pulled it down, the metal joints stiff from disuse. My heart pounded with each rung I climbed, as though I were ascending into another life, another version of my family's history that had been locked away. The attic was exactly what I had feared and expected: dim, close, suffocating. Dust motes danced in the narrow beam of sunlight slicing through a broken window. The smell of age was overwhelming, a mix of wood rot, dust, and something faintly metallic. And there, pushed against the far wall beneath a sagging beam, was the trunk. It was large, wooden, bound in iron, with a rusted lock dangling uselessly. My throat tightened. Even before I reached it, I knew this was what she had hidden from all of us. I knelt, brushing dust away, my fingers trembling as they found the seam. The lock gave way under the force of a screwdriver I had brought from my car. The sound of the metal snapping echoed too loudly, and for a moment I froze, half expecting someone to come running up the ladder. When no one did, I lifted the lid. Inside, carefully arranged, were stacks of photographs and bundles of letters tied with twine so brittle it nearly crumbled in my hands. A smell of old paper and something faintly sweet rose up, choking me with memory. These weren't just mementos. They were records, evidence. I sifted through the photographs first. Faces stared back at me in black and white, serious, unsmiling, caught in candid moments. Some I recognized from old family albums, distant cousins and neighbors.
Others were strangers.
Survived. And among the names was one that made me drop the paper as though it had burned me. My grandfather's. I had never known him. He had died before I was born. But in every story my father told, he was a man of integrity, a hard-working figure who had kept the family afloat through hard years. Seeing his name here, nestled among others labeled with debt and scandal, shattered something inside me. Had my grandmother discovered something about him? Something dark enough to document, to hide, to fear? I dug deeper, searching for context, but the deeper I went, the stranger it became. A ledger appeared, filled with coded symbols beside the same names. Some columns marked with crosses, others with dollar signs. The language was fractured but unmistakable. This was tracking of people, of money, of outcomes. The attic air grew heavier, as though I had unearthed not just dust, but ghosts pressing close to watch me uncover what they had worked so hard to conceal. And then, at the very bottom of the trunk, beneath a faded quilt and one last bundle of letters, I saw it. An envelope. My breath caught when I saw the name scrawled across it. Mine. The ink was faded, the edges yellowed, but it was unmistakable. My grandmother's hand, shaky but certain. She had written my name. The envelope was sealed, untouched. For a moment, I couldn't move. It felt as though the attic had gone utterly silent, the dust motes frozen midair. My hands shook as I reached for it, my entire body vibrating with the realization that whatever was inside had been meant for me alone. Not for my father, not for my uncle, not for anyone else, just me. And as I slid the envelope into my pocket, one thought consumed me. What could be so dangerous, so personal, that my grandmother had waited for her death to put it in my hands? The envelope was addressed to me, but it was written 20 years before I was born. For a long time, I couldn't bring myself to tear it open. I sat cross-legged on the dusty attic floor, the light slanting through the broken window like an accusation, holding the envelope in my trembling hands. My name was written across the front, my journals, but here it was heavier, as though every word had caught. To the granddaughter who will carry my burden, my throat tightened. You do not know me yet, but one day you will. By the time you read these words, I will be gone, but the danger will not be. This family has built its walls on silence, and silence has always demanded its. The women in this family always pay it. I froze, rereading the line again and again. The women in this family always pay. The attic pressed in around me, the weight of dust and history. What had my grandmother paid? And was I already paying it without realizing? The letter continued, each word more haunting than the last. I do not write this to frighten you, but to prepare you. You will be told not to ask questions. You will be told to obey, to keep quiet, to let the past rest. But if you do, you will become another casualty of their silence. I cannot tell you everything in these pages, not yet. But know this, not all blood can be trusted. Look to those who fear your questions most. They are the ones with the darkest answers. My hands tightened on the paper, the edges cutting into my skin. She had known. She had known that someone would try to bury her words, to erase the past. She had even known I would be the one to find them. The letter shifted tone, almost like a whisper from the grave. You are not the first to dig. There were others before you, sisters, cousins, daughters. They were silenced, some by shame, some by force. Remember this, patterns repeat until someone breaks them. Do not let them break you. My breath hit. She was speaking across time, across generations, as if she had seen the shape of my life long before it unfolded. I wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off as paranoia written in the solitude of age, but the note I had found in my bedroom drawer. Stop digging, or you'll end up like her. Grandfather in glowing terms, who had avoided every hard question about our family's past.
Could she mean them? Or was that my fear bending her words? The final lines of the letter made my skin prickle. If you are reading this, they have failed to stop you. But you are not safe yet. There is one who remembers, a witness who knows what happened. They live still, though hidden. Find them, and you will find the truth. Until then, trust no one but these words. They are all I could leave you. My eyes scanned the letter again, desperate for a name, an address, anything concrete. But all she gave me was a promise. There is one who remembers. The silence in the attic grew unbearable. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching for me, and I shoved the letter back into its envelope, tucking it against my chest like a lifeline. I climbed down the ladder unsteadily, every creak of the old house echoing louder in my ears. The farmhouse walls seemed to hum with secrets, each one pressing in closer. I couldn't stop hearing her words. The women in this family always pay the price. Was that what had happened to her? Was her death natural, or was it the price she had warned me about? And if she had been silenced, what chance did I have of surviving long enough to uncover the truth? Back in my car, I locked the doors and sat for several long minutes, my hands still trembling on the wheel. The letter lay in my lap, fragile and powerful, its words rattling inside me. Somewhere out there, alive and breathing, was a witness to whatever horror my grandmother had been circling around all her life. Someone who had seen, someone who had not spoken, someone who could finally tell me what my family had buried. And as I drove away from the farmhouse, one thought consumed me. Whoever that witness was, I had to find them before the people who left me that warning note found me first. The journals named her only as M.E., but when I tracked her down, she slammed the door in my face. The letter wouldn't leave my mind. There is one who remembers. Those words followed me everywhere, through restless sleep, through the long hours at work when my hands moved automatically but my thoughts circled like vultures. If there really was a witness, I had
Summers. I combed through community directories, old newspapers, even obituaries. The town was small, and its records were stubbornly thorough. Names came and went, but eventually I found her. Margaret Ellis, born 1942. Once active in church circles, then vanished from records in the mid-1990s. No marriage record, no death certificate, just gone. It took weeks of whispers and side conversations before I finally learned more. An elderly librarian, her voice low with caution, leaned close across the desk one afternoon. "Margaret Ellis doesn't go by that name anymore," she whispered. "Moved out to the edge of Hollow Creek. Folks say she wanted to disappear." Disappear. The word chilled me. Why would a woman in her 70s need to erase herself from her own community? Unless she knew something too dangerous to keep. I drove to Hollow Creek the next morning. The road wound past sagging barns and rusted mailboxes, the kind of place where strangers were noticed immediately. Her house was small, a weathered cottage tucked behind overgrown hedges, its blinds drawn tight against the world. I parked on the shoulder, my heart thudding. My grandmother's words, her letter about witnesses and betrayals, pushed me forward. I climbed the uneven steps and knocked. At first, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. I knocked again, louder this time. The door creaked open just enough for me to glimpse a pair of wary eyes. "I'm looking for Margaret Ellis," I said quickly, trying to sound calm. "My grandmother was—" The door slammed shut so hard the frame rattled. I stood frozen, staring at the peeling paint, my pulse in my throat. But I wasn't going to leave. I knocked again, softer this time. "Please, my grandmother was Ellen Wells. She wrote about you." For a long time, silence pressed back. Then a voice, raspy with age and fear, came from behind the door. "You shouldn't be." I pressed my palm flat against the wood. "I just want the truth. Please, I know she trusted you. She left your initials in her journals." The lock clicked reluctantly, and the door opened a crack. Margaret Ellis, M.E., stood before me. She was older than I'd imagined, her frame slight, her face lined not just with years but with secrets too heavy to carry. Her eyes darted to the road behind me before
that you saw what happened. Her face pinched as though I had slapped her. For a moment I thought she would throw me out. Then she lowered herself into a chair, her hands shaking as she gripped the armrest. "I was there," she whispered finally, "the night everything changed. Your grandmother and we saw something we were never meant to see." My breath caught. She closed her eyes, as if the memory itself burned. "It wasn't just your uncle. It wasn't just your father. It was bigger." A gathering at the orchard, men with money and power, women too scared to speak. Something happened. Something that should have ended in the courthouse, in handcuffs. But it was covered up, paid off, buried under lies. Her voice cracked. "We swore we'd never talk. And I kept that promise. But Ellen, she couldn't keep silent. It ate her alive. And now," she looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, "now it's eating you." I leaned forward. "What did you see? Please, I need to know." She shook her head violently. "No. If I tell you, they'll know I spoke. They'll finish what they started." Fear radiated from her in waves, but beneath it was something else. Guilt. A guilt that had festered for decades. I wanted to push harder, to demand details, but I remembered my grandmother's letter. Not all blood can be trusted. If Margaret had survived this long by hiding, pressing her too far might drive her deeper into silence. Instead, I softened my voice. "She trusted you. She left me your initials for a reason. Please, if you can't tell me everything, just tell me what to watch for." For a long time she stared at me. Then she reached for my hand, her skin papery and trembling. "They'll smile while they're watching you," she whispered. "That's how you'll know. You won't see anger, you'll see kindness. But underneath, they're counting your steps, waiting for you to slip. Don't let them see you stumble." Her grip tightened suddenly, fierce for someone so frail. "They're watching you now." The words landed like a stone in my chest. I pulled my hand free and stumbled out of the cottage, the weight of her warning pressing into my bones. With shredded rubber from all 4 of my tires, sliced clean through. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted to scare me, they wanted me trapped, cornered, reminded that they could touch my life whenever they pleased. For the first time since this began, I thought seriously about walking away, about burning the journals, boarding up my grandmother's secrets, pretending ignorance. It would have been safer, easier. But as I stood there, staring at that nailed bird, the image seared into my mind. Anger surged hotter than fear. Whoever they were, they had underestimated me. They thought they could frighten me into silence, just as they had frightened my grandmother. I wasn't going to let them win. That night, after replacing the tires and scrubbing the blood from the door with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, I turned again to the journals. I spread them across the kitchen table, covering it in decades of ink and memory. This time, I looked more closely. I didn't just read, I studied. And as I traced my grandmother's words, I began to notice patterns. Certain letters bolded just slightly in her handwriting, as though pressed harder than the others. The first letters of paragraphs aligning to spell words when read vertically. Dates written in unusual formats, as though pointing to something else entirely. Layered codes. She hadn't only written a diary, she had written a map of betrayal in riddles, hiding her truth in plain sight for someone who cared enough to look closely. One acrostic caught my eye. The first letters of each line on a page from the late 1960s spelled Father O'Rourke. My breath caught. Father O'Rourke. The town priest when my grandmother was a young woman. I barely remembered his name from the few times my grandmother had mentioned the old church, but she had never spoken of him with the disdain she reserved for other family members. There had been something softer in her tone. Could he have been her ally? The thought took root and wouldn't let go. If she had trusted him enough to hide his name in code, maybe he had been the one she confided in when no one else would listen. Maybe he had known everything. I needed to know what he had left behind. The church was quiet when I arrived the next morning, the heavy doors groaning as I pushed them open. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows, painting fractured colors across the pews. The air smelled of candle wax and incense, heavy with memory. I made my way to the back, where the parish office held shelves. Names from my grandmother's journals. Names from the trunk in the attic. These weren't just church records. They were battlegrounds where truth had been rewritten. My pulse quickened as I found Father O'Rourke's own entry. Death, 1974. Cause, heart failure. But the ink looked wrong, darker than the other entries on the page, as though added later. And beneath the words, faint erasure marks lingered, shadows of whatever had been written first. I tilted the page toward the light, my eyes straining. There it was, the original words, faint but still visible. Head wound. My stomach lurched. His death hadn't been natural. It had been rewritten. I sat back, the ledger trembling in my hands. My grandmother's ally, the man she had trusted enough to immortalize in her codes, hadn't died of heart failure. He had been silenced. And if they had silenced him, what chance did I have? The silence of the church pressed in around me, suffocating. Dust hung in the shafts of light like suspended ash. I could almost feel eyes watching from the shadows of the pews, unseen but present. I forced the ledger closed and shoved it back into its place, my heartbeat a frantic drum. As I stepped into the aisle, one thought consumed me. If they had staged his death to keep the truth buried, then every step I took now was dragging me closer to the same fate. And the deeper I dug, the louder one truth screamed in my ears. My grandmother hadn't just been warning me. She had been preparing me for war. I thought the priest was dead until I received a letter signed in his name. For days, the church records haunted me. The erased cause of death, the word head wound lingering like a whisper beneath heart failure. I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth about Father O'Rourke's end had been hidden with deliberate care. But nothing could have prepared me for what arrived in the mail the following week. The envelope was plain, its edges worn, the postmark from a small town 2 states away. There was no return address, no hint of who had sent it. At first, I assumed it was junk mail, another catalog or flyer that slipped through. But when I tore it open, the paper inside made my breath catch. It was a pleasantries, without introduction, as though he had been waiting to speak to me all along. If you are reading this, then Ellen has passed the torch. She was braver than most, and she carried the weight longer than she should have. But you must know, she was not imagining things, she was recording them, and they will come for you, just as they came for her. I gripped the edge of the table, my vision blurring. He wrote of the orchard gatherings, of money exchanged in back rooms, of accidents arranged to silence those who questioned. He wrote of land deeds altered, properties stolen under forged signatures, families pushed aside to consolidate control. And woven through it all was a single thread, my own blood. Your family was at the center, the letter continued. Not just Robert, not just your father. Others, too. They wore respectability like armor, but underneath was greed and worse. Ellen tried to document it in her journals. I tried to protect her. When my warnings grew too loud, they staged my death. It was safer for me to let the town believe I was gone. My chest tightened. So the erasures in the church record hadn't been incompetence. They had been strategy. I skimmed faster, my eyes devouring every line. He named names. My Uncle Robert, yes, but also my father, my grandfather, and cousins I barely remembered. He spoke of fraud, of land grabs disguised as community projects, of financial records manipulated through church connections. He hinted at darker things, deaths that had been passed off as natural, drownings labeled as accidents, one particularly haunting reference to the girl who never came home from the orchard. My stomach lurched. My grandmother had been right to fear. The more I read, the more the ground seemed to tilt beneath me. My family wasn't simply flawed or greedy, they were dangerous. They had built their lives on foundations of lies, and anyone who threatened to expose those lies had been eliminated or forced into silence. And now it was my turn. The last paragraph of the letter made my blood run cold. You must continue Ellen's work, but tread carefully. Betrayal runs deep in your line. Remember this above all, the one you love most will betray you. I read the words again and again, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. The one I love most. Who? I thought of my father, etched into my brain like a prophecy I couldn't escape. The one you love most will betray you. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I didn't know who I loved most, which meant I didn't know who was going to destroy me. The betrayal came from where I least expected. My mother. I had barely slept since reading Father O'Rourke's letter. His words replayed in my head like a broken record, each one carving deeper into my mind. The one you love most will betray you. It was a curse disguised as a warning, and it made me suspicious of everyone. By the time morning came, my nerves were shot. Every creak in the floorboards, every knock on the door felt like danger pressing closer. I was still clutching the letter in my hand when I heard my front door open without a knock. It was my mother. She stormed in as if she owned the place, her hair disheveled, her face pale with fury. For a moment, she looked less like the composed woman who had raised me, and more like a stranger wearing her skin. She slammed the door shut, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. "You need to stop this," she hissed. Her voice carried something sharper than anger. It was fear, wrapped in desperation. I blinked at her, stunned. Stop what? Her eyes flicked to the table, to the scattered journals and the letter that still trembled in my hand. "This," she snapped, digging, reading, stirring up things that were buried for a reason. I felt the ground shift beneath me. "You knew," I whispered. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't deny it. The silence between us was louder than any scream. My entire life I had believed my mother was distant but harmless, too consumed by appearances and family obligations to notice the shadows that haunted me. But now I saw the truth. She had always known. "How long?" I demanded, my voice rising. Her eyes glossed with tears, but she didn't look away. "Always. I grew up with it. I married into it. You think your grandmother was the only one who saw what this family really is? We all did. We just chose differently." The words pierced.
Fleeting moment, I saw something raw beneath the mask she wore. Pain. Regret. The kind of wound that never heals. But it didn't erase the betrayal. I thought of every moment she had brushed off my questions, every time she had shamed me for being too curious, too stubborn, too much like Grandma. All along, she hadn't been protecting me. She had been protecting them. "You betrayed me," I whispered. She flinched as though I had struck her. "No, I tried to protect you. Don't you see? I thought if I kept you away from all of this, maybe you'd have a chance to live a normal life. But you're too much like her. You couldn't let it go, and now—" Her voice trailed off, heavy with dread. I wanted to scream. I wanted to collapse into her arms. Instead, I stood frozen between rage and heartbreak. "You were supposed to protect me by telling me the truth," I said, my voice shaking. "Not by hiding it. Not by letting me walk blind into their traps." Tears slid down her cheeks. "I couldn't. If I told you everything, they would have taken you from me. You don't know what they're capable of. You think you do, but you don't." I clenched my fists, fury boiling inside me. "Then tell me now. If you've been carrying this, if you've been living in their shadow, tell me what you've been hiding." She shook her head violently. "It's too dangerous." "Dangerous?" I spat. "More dangerous than being lied to my whole life? More dangerous than watching my grandmother die without knowing why? More dangerous than being hunted in my own home?" Her shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of her, leaving only exhaustion. For the first time, she looked older than her years, worn down by secrets too heavy to carry. "You want the truth?" she whispered. "Fine. Here it is. Your grandmother didn't die naturally." The words struck me like a blow. My knees buckled, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling. My grandmother, whose death I had mourned, whose coffin I had watched lowered into the ground, whose journals I had clutched like lifelines, had not died the way I thought. "She was silenced," my mother said, her voice trembling, "because she got too close, because she wouldn't stop." The room spun around me. The betrayal of silence, of my grandmother's handwriting pressed deep into the pages like grooves cut into history itself. These weren't just diaries anymore. They were testimony. They were her voice beyond the grave. And now they were mine to carry. I cried for hours that night. I cried for the grandmother I'd lost, for the innocence stripped away from my family's legacy, and for the realization that my own mother had chosen silence over truth. The grief was unbearable, but beneath it something stronger grew: resolve. If my grandmother had been murdered for refusing to stop, then I couldn't stop either. By morning, my tears had dried.
My hands shook as I spread everything across my dining room table. The journals, the letters, the coded lists from the trunk, the envelope with my name written decades before I was born. I arranged them like puzzle pieces, searching for a pattern, for proof strong enough to shatter the wall of lies built around my family. But I couldn't do it alone. That afternoon, I drove into town and parked outside the office of the local paper. It was an old brick building with faded lettering on the windows, a relic from an era when print had power. Inside, the hum of ancient computers mixed with the scent of ink and dust. I asked for the investigative desk, and that's how I met Daniel Hale. He was in his 40s, sharp-eyed but cautious, the kind of man who had seen too many stories buried before they ever reached the front page. When I laid the journals in front of him, his eyebrows furrowed. He read slowly, carefully, his lips moving silently as he traced each line of my grandmother's words. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim. "You understand what this means?" he asked. I nodded. My throat was dry. "These names," he said, tapping one page. "These aren't just old neighbors. Some of them are tied to land deals, county contracts, even state politics. If what's written here is true, then your grandmother wasn't just documenting family secrets. She was documenting crimes, big ones. And the people connected to them, they're not the kind who forgive or forget." A chill crawled up my spine. "So what do I do?" Daniel leaned back, folding his arms.
If we slowed, only when I reached my street did it peel away, vanishing into the maze of houses like it had never been there. That night, sleep was impossible. I left lights on in every room. I double-checked the locks. I kept the journals stacked beside my bed as if I could guard them with sheer proximity. But the accidents began anyway. The next morning, I found my mailbox pried open, letters scattered across the lawn. The day after, I returned from the grocery store to find my back door ajar, though nothing appeared stolen. Once, I caught the faint smell of smoke in my garage, only to discover someone had burned a rag in a coffee can and left it smoldering near the gas tank of my car. They weren't accidents. They were warnings. I told Daniel, and his face grew tighter with each word. "They know you're digging," he said, "which means you're close to something." His reassurance was hollow. Being close to the truth meant being closer to danger. 2 nights later, danger came home. I woke to the sound of glass breaking. My heart slammed against my ribs as I sat up in bed, the darkness thick and heavy around me. For a moment, I thought I had dreamed it. Then came the unmistakable creak of footsteps on the wooden floor below. Someone was inside. I grabbed my phone, but there was no time to call anyone. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, until they paused outside my bedroom door. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. Then the doorknob turned, slowly, carefully, like someone testing the lock. I held my breath, clutching the journals to my chest, and then, just as suddenly, the sound retreated. A door slammed. Silence followed. By the time the police arrived, the intruder was gone. My front door hung open, the lock splintered. Drawers were yanked out, cabinets overturned, shelves emptied. But the real devastation came when I returned to my bedroom. The journals were gone. Every single one. I collapsed onto the floor, the weight of their absence crushing me. They had taken everything. My grandmother's voice, her secrets, her testimony. It felt like losing her all over again. But then, as I gathered the scattered debris, I noticed something. A single torn page left behind, half crumpled under the bed. The ink was smudged, but the words were clear enough to read. It wasn't random. It wasn't overlooked. It was deliberate. A message. And tarnished bronze plaques, honoring judges long dead. To most people in town, it was simply the place where licenses were issued, disputes were settled, and juries filed in and out. To me, it had become something else entirely. A vault not only of records, but of truth, buried deliberately for decades. The morning I walked inside, my palms were slick with sweat. The air smelled of dust, ink, and old wood polish, the kind of scent that clung to courthouses across America. I went straight to the archives room. A heavy oak door opened into a dim space lined with rows of steel cabinets. A single clerk sat behind a desk, an older woman with gray hair pulled into a bun,
glasses perched at the end of her nose. She looked up when I entered. "Research?" she asked in a tired but kind voice. "Yes," I said, my throat tightened. "I need to see case files tied to the Whitmore family." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. She hesitated. "That's a restricted category. What's your purpose?" I swallowed hard. "Personal history." For a long moment, she simply studied me. I thought she would refuse, but then her expression softened. "I knew your grandmother," she said quietly. "She came here often." Always asking questions, always hitting walls. That startled me. "She did?" The clerk nodded. "She believed this place held answers." Maybe she was right. "Give me a moment." She rose from her desk and disappeared into the back vault. My heart hammered as I waited. The minutes dragged like hours. When she returned, she carried a thick envelope sealed with red tape. She placed it on the desk between us. "This was supposed to be sealed indefinitely," she said, "but the truth has a way of demanding air. Don't tell anyone where you got it." My hands trembled as I broke the tape and opened the file. The first page was a case header. Year, 1968. Plaintiff, Margaret Ellis. Defendant, Whitmore Family Estate. I froze. Margaret Ellis. The initials MEI had tracked down weeks earlier. She had been right all along. The case summary detailed the wrongful death of Margaret's brother, a farmhand employed by my grandfather. He had died in what was reported as an accident, equipment malfunction on the cache. It was all there, documented in black and white. And then, at the very bottom of the file, I saw it. The signature. Sharp, elegant, unmistakable. My grandfather's name. He had signed the settlement papers himself. It was no longer rumor, no longer whispers or coded journal entries. It was proof. My grandfather had not only been tied to corruption, he had orchestrated. I sat frozen, staring at the ink that had damned him, ink that had damned us all by extension. My chest tightened, breath shallow. The man whose portrait hung in the family parlor, whose name was etched into plaques across town, had been guilty of fraud, bribery, and perhaps even murder. This was the legacy my grandmother had been fighting against. This was the reason she left breadcrumbs for me to follow. And now I was holding the evidence she had died for. The clerk leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "You see now, don't you? Why people wanted this sealed?" I nodded numbly, clutching the papers to my chest. But even as I stood to leave, a shadow of dread followed me. If this file was real, if this proof fell into the wrong hands, I would not just be the granddaughter digging into old stories. I would be the target of powerful people who had spent decades burying this truth. And as I stepped out of the courthouse into the blazing afternoon sun, one thought consumed me. I finally had proof, but proof could get me killed. The deeper I dug, the more dangerous it became, until I realized my uncle was following me. For weeks I had felt eyes on me. Every time I left the courthouse, every time I drove home from Daniel's office, the sensation lingered. At first, I told myself it was paranoia. After all, I'd already been stalked, threatened, broken into. Of course I was jumpy. But then I began noticing the same car, a black sedan, parked across from my house at odd hours, in my rearview mirror when I drove to the grocery store, slowing when I slowed, vanishing when I turned suddenly. It was my uncle's car. The realization gutted me. The man who had once carried me on his shoulders at family picnics, who had smiled with the warmth of a protector, was now hunting me. I decided to confront him. It was evening we got here. Wealth, reputation, respect. By being soft. By letting every fool with a grudge drag us through the mud. Number. We made a pact, decades ago, to protect the family, to bury what needed burying. Your grandmother agreed, once, but she broke it. My breath caught. She didn't break it. She told the truth. He stepped closer, his face inches from mine. And that's why she's dead. The word struck like a blow to the chest. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. He didn't even flinch. didn't soften. He had admitted it, not in so many words, but enough. Enough to confirm what I had feared. My hands trembled, but I forced my voice steady. You silenced her. She forced our hand, he said coldly. She couldn't let it rest. She thought she could expose us, destroy us. She thought wrong, and now you're making the same mistake. My heart pounded, but beneath the fear, a spark of determination ignited, because what he didn't know was that my phone, hidden in my pocket, was recording every word. I had his confession. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of power shift in my favor. I let him keep talking, let him damn himself further. He ranted about loyalty, about legacy, about how the family had thrived by protecting itself at all costs. He spat venom about my grandmother, painting her as a traitor rather than a truth-teller. And in his words, I heard clarity. Grandma had known. She had understood that silence was the true weapon of our family, the poison passed down through generations, and she had chosen to break it. Not to save herself, she must have known what it would cost, but to leave me the fragments, the journals, the breadcrumbs. She had given me the chance to finish what she started. I understood now. My grandmother hadn't died simply because she stumbled too close to the truth. She had died because she chose to pass that truth on. She had sacrificed herself to give me the evidence, to give me the chance to end it. I swallowed hard, staring at the man who had once seemed larger than life. You'll never bury it, I said, pulled up to my chest. The steady beep of a monitor kept time with my pulse, reminding me I was still alive. For a long moment, I couldn't remember how I had gotten there. Then the memory hit. My uncle, lunging, his hand closing in, his eyes wild with rage. I jolted upright, panic flooding me. But a nurse appeared instantly, gently pressing me back against the pillow. You're safe, she said softly. You're in St. Mary's. You were brought in last night. Safe. The word felt fragile, as though it might shatter if I breathed too hard. What happened? I rasped. She explained. A bystander had been walking their dog near my street, heard the shouting, and rushed to intervene. They pulled my uncle off me, called 911, and stayed until the police arrived. If not for that stranger, I might not have woken up at all. My throat tightened. For weeks I had felt utterly alone, hunted by shadows. Yet in the moment I needed it most, an ordinary person, a complete stranger, had stepped in and saved my life. But survival didn't mean the danger was over. The next day, a detective visited my room. He confirmed my uncle had been arrested at the scene, but his expression was tight, his words careful. He's claiming it was a misunderstanding. Says he was just trying to stop you from hurting yourself. With his connections, the case could drag family influence. Money, reputation, favors owed. The same weapons they had used for decades to bury the truth. Still, I had one advantage they hadn't anticipated. I had the recording. His voice, his words, his confession, captured on my phone before he lunged. And as though fate were aligning, the nurse soon brought me my belongings. Among them was a battered cardboard box. My breath caught when I opened it. The journals. They hadn't been lost after all. The police had recovered them from my uncle's car. He had tried to steal them permanently, but in his arrogance he hadn't destroyed them. Now they were back in my hands, scarred but intact. I ran my fingers over the cracked leather spines, tears stinging my eyes. My grandmother's voice was still here. Strong, he admitted. But if we go through the courts, they'll drag it out for years. Your family's influence runs deep. By the time justice comes, if it comes at all, you'll be broken down and discredited. They'll smear your name the way they smeared your grandmother's, maybe worse. I shook my head. So what do we do? He leaned forward. We take it public. All of it. Not a headline, not a single article buried on page 4. A broadcast, live.
with documents, with testimony, with your voice. We don't give them time to twist it. We force the truth into the light." His words terrified me. A live broadcast meant there would be no turning back, no way to hide once the story was out. It meant putting myself on the line, exposing every secret my family had worked so hard to bury. But then I thought of Grandma's words. They can't take the truth if you hold on tight enough. I looked Daniel in the eye. "I'll do it." His shoulders eased, but his voice was steady. "Good. We'll set it up. Tomorrow night. Get some rest. You'll need it." As he left, I lay back against the hospital pillows, the journals resting on my lap. My heart pounded with fear, but also with something I hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Grandma had fought. She had died for the truth, and now it was my turn to carry her voice where it could no longer be silenced. I closed the journal, clutching it to my chest. Tomorrow, the whole world would know. The night I read Grandma's last entry to the world, I felt her hand on my shoulder. The lights were blinding, hotter than I expected. My palms were slick, my throat tight, and the stack of journals on the podium in front of me felt heavier than stone. Behind the cameras, rows of reporters leaned forward, pens poised, recorders flashing red. Across the globe, live feeds had been announced, drawing in strangers who would soon hear my family's secrets. Secrets buried for decades, guarded with threats, paid for in blood. Daniel stood just off to the side, giving me a steady nod. But once the broadcast began, it would just be G and the truth. I took a breath that trembled at first, but steadied as I looked down at the cracked leather journal, the one that had started it all. My grandmother's words, her legacy, her testimony. This,
through the room as I lifted another folder from the podium, the courthouse file sealed for decades. This is the wrongful death case of Margaret Ellis's brother, buried by money and political favors. Here are the settlement papers, signed by my grandfather, proving his guilt. I held up the page, his signature glaring under the lights. Reporters surged forward, cameras snapping furiously. "And this," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket, "is the voice of my uncle, confessing to the family pact to silence anyone who dared tell the truth, including my grandmother." The audio played over the speakers, his voice unmistakable, venom dripping in every word. "That's why she's dead." The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions, flashes blinded me, and in the chaos, I felt a strange calm wash over me. Because this was what Grandma had wanted. Not whispers in the dark. Not secrets passed like poison from one generation to the next. The truth. Loud enough that no one could bury it again. I steadied my voice and read one final entry. "To my granddaughter. If you carry this burden, know that I love you. Know that you were always meant to be the one to break the chain." My throat closed, but I forced myself to finish. I am that granddaughter, and tonight I am breaking the chain. The fallout was immediate. The broadcast went viral within hours, spreading across networks, news feeds, and social media. #WhitmoreTruth trended by midnight. Calls for investigation flooded the state attorney's office. By dawn, warrants had been issued. My uncle was charged not only for the attack on me, but for obstruction and conspiracy. Financial investigators descended on my family's estate, freezing accounts, seizing property tied to decades of fraud. Even my mother, though not charged, faced the crushing weight of disgrace as her complicity came to light. The family name, once gilded in respect, was now smeared across every headline in the country. And through it all, I clutched the journals. In the quiet after the storm, I returned to my grandmother's grave. The cameras were gone, the reporters chasing the next headline. It was just me, the cool evening air, and the headstone etched with her name. "I did it," I whispered, laying the worn people watching me now, clutching their own buried history. I turned from the grave. My voice carried not just to the night sky, but to the invisible audience I knew would still be listening. Have you ever wondered what secrets your family chose to bury? And what they would do to keep them hidden? The question lingered in the air, heavy, unanswerable, because I knew the truth. Some secrets don't stay buried. If this story pulled you in, Make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the next reveal. And tell me in the comments what's the one family secret you've never been allowed to ask about. Because your stories matter too. If you believe the truth shouldn't stay buried, tap like to help more people discover this journey. And don't forget to share the video with someone who loves mystery and real-life twists. And when you're ready for the next chapter, head to the pinned Secrets We Keep episode waiting for you right after this.